Continuing on with our app, let's see the state of our application, where we left off. So we have 4 tabs. The first tab created this scale animation. Second tab, we have our constraints animation happening. Third tab, we have a transition animation with the cat and the dog fighting with each other here for position. Next, we will create a property animator. We overviewed what a property animator does. So a property animator takes in fractions and it's going to animate over the lifetime of that animation. So what we'll have here on our scene is a slider. We'll have a slider and we'll have a duck. So as we slide in from, say, left to right, we'll scale the duck or we'll stretch the duck. And when we go back to 0, we'll put the duck back in its original position. Everybody? Right? Cool. So let's go ahead and set that up. Somewhere I have Xcode. Okay, so let's go to our storyboard for our property animator. Property animator is, we need an image view.
Can we try it with a label and see what?
A label?
Oh, never mind.
We could use a label, but later, right? We'll probably use the label with the swipe. Cool? All right, so here, let's get an image view. Okay, so we have an image view here. This image view will have our duck image in there, right? So go ahead and drag in an image view, and we'll set the constraints for that image view. The constraints will be very similar to what we did before. We'll have a square image. So let's set the constraints for our square image. So click on our square image and go to Add Constraints. We want to center our image horizontally, and we want to center it vertically. So we'll go ahead and click on our horizontally constrained container and also vertically constrained. So we have 2 constraints here. Right? If I want to make my image view half the width of my screen, what constraint am I adding to it? Yeah, Tiff? Go ahead. So I'll control drag from my image view to my super view and set it to equal width, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll control drag from my image view over to my super view, and I'll select equal width. And what if I want to have the height proportionally equal to the width? What am I doing? Yes, Christian? So I'll control drag to itself. And what am I selecting? Aspect ratio. Perfect. And at that point, where are we going to edit our constraints? Size inspector. So Yulia says we'll go to our size inspector. So now let's go over to our size inspector. Let me zoom in here. So in the size inspector, I will edit my width here to say 0.5. Press enter, and I'll also edit the aspect ratio, correct? And what's the aspect ratio? 1 to 1. Very good. So at this point, we will get a square. Perfect. Cool. So now we have our duck image somewhere. We'll click on our image view. We'll go to Attribute Inspector, and we'll look for our duck image. So duck, come back to me, duck. Great. So at this point, we have our duck. Everybody has access to the duck image? All right, perfect. Next, we'll go ahead and add in a slider right below our duck. The slider will be the control to animate our duck. In that case, we will be stretching the duck. So we'll be using a transform to scale the duck as we scroll our slider. So let's go ahead and add in a slider. So we type in slider in our object library, and we drag in a slider right about here, the center of our device. We'll drag our trail in to about our blue guideline, and we'll drag our lead in to our blue guideline. So we have our slider on screen. Now we'll go ahead and set the constraints for our slider. So having my slider selected, I'll click on Add New Constraints for my slider. I'll make my slider say 40 points to the lead-in of the device. We don't want it to be too close to the edge, so we'll say 40 points. We'll also make our slider 40 points from the trailing edge, so 40 points here. And for the bottom, I'll keep it at 122, if that's the default it has, and we'll say add 3 constraints. Perfect. Before we continue on, we'll run our application to make sure it renders correctly. So we'll go ahead and run our app. Right, so we run our app, we got the Pursuit logo, that scales up. We have our Swift logo that animates into a circle. We go to our constraints, we have a down button that animates our box down. We have an up button that animates our view. We go to our transition. There we have our dog going to a cat image. We also have the cat going back to a dog image. And now we're working on our 4th animation where we want to move the slider, right? Right now we move the slider and nothing happens because we haven't wired up our slider to code. So we'll wire up our slider to code and we'll make some animation such that the duck animates as well using UI View Property Animator. Great. At this point, let's open up our assistant editor. Right? So we have our scene and we have our code next to our scene. Great. So at this point, verify and make sure we have our duck scene right next to our property animator controller. So they're next to each other, so we could control drag. We love control dragging. So we'll go ahead and control drag our duck image over to our controller. And here, we'll just simply call it duck image. So duck image is of type UI image view. We'll say connect. Great. Next, we'll go ahead and get the slider as well. We'll get an outlet for the slider. So I control drag from my slider over to my view controller, and I call it slider. So at this point, we have 2 outlets. We have our duck image, and we have our slider. What else do we need for the slider? We need some sort of action, right? Thank you very much. So we need some sort of action, so when I move my slider, I could get updates of what my slider value is. Because my slider value, I'll use that value and plug that value into my UI View Animator property. So as I scale that slider up, my animation will scale up as well. So let's go ahead and create an action, as Julia says here. So I'll control drag from my slider over to my view controller. I'll change the type to say UI slider, and I'll change the name to say slider did change. So slider did change, and I'll press connect. Great. Cool. At this point, we are done with the assistant editor. We wired up our duck to its outlet. We wired up the slider to the action. So at this point, we could close and go back to our controller. So controller, property animator controller, and write code. So what are we doing here? First, we need an instance. So here we need an instance to UI View Property Animator. We'll start off, we'll say it's a var, we'll call it Animator. It's of type UI View Property Animator. We'll mark it private. Good point here. We'll mark it private because nobody else needs access to our animator property outside of our view controller. Great. In our view did load, we will actually instantiate our animator here. So instantiate the animator property. Cool. So here we'll say animator equal to UI view animator. And we'll use duration with curve. So the UI view animator, like we did with our animations before, we'll give it some duration and we'll give it some curve value. So for our time interval, we'll say 2 seconds. For our curve value, we'll say curve. We'll make it easy in and out. And for the animations, this is where we put our block of animation. So here we declare the animation. Okay? So with a property animator, it will work with our slider. As we change our slider, we'll take that value, the current value of the slider, and we'll add it to the fraction complete property of the animator. So today is the first time we've seen UI view animator. It's very powerful in iOS, right? As we demonstrated earlier with the Google Maps, as you pan, you could have a UI view property animator getting called there. So we have access to our animator. Let's go to our slider action. Cool. In our slider action, we'll use our animator dot fraction complete. What type does fraction complete take? A CG float, right? So it takes in a CG float, and on our sender, we have a value, and our value is a float. So we need to convert our sender value from float to a CG float. That way it could work with our fraction complete data. So we need to typecast our sender to a float value. At this point, build your app and make sure that works. The minimum, we'll set it to 0, and the maximum, we'll keep it at 1. Okay? So we'll go do that now. And here we'll perform a transform. So here to do, we'll perform a transform. And let's go set, as you guys are pointing out, let's go set our default slider value to 0. Okay, so when it starts off, it doesn't start off at halfway on my slider, but it starts at 0. So let's go navigate over to our storyboard and do that. Very good. So we'll go to our property animator storyboard, click on your slider, go to attribute inspector, zoom in here. So our value is 0.5, that's fine. The minimum is 0, but the value here, let's change it to say 0. Instead of 0.5, change it to 0. And that should be fine for now. Let's run our app and verify the change. We'll navigate back to our property, and we are not set to 0. Okay, let's verify this. What's going on here? Let's see. Value 0.5, minimum value is 0. Did I not press enter? Press enter, run it again. Make sure we press enter in Xcode every time because the commit needs to happen. Let's see what we have. Great. So at this point, we're starting from 0. We haven't added the animation, but we know we're starting from 0. Do we all confirm we're starting from 0 on our slider? Very good. Perfect. Let's continue on to our controller. I want to make a transform such that I stretch my duck, right, in the x-axis. What transformation am I performing? A scale, right? Very good. So scaling will stretch it, right? We have scaling. What other transforms we have? We spoke about earlier. Scale, rotation, Translation, very good. And translation moves an object from A to B. Very good. So here we'll perform a transform. In our block here, we'll say self.duckImage.transform equal to, let's get some more space here, and CG affine transform. We want to scale. I want to scale in the x-axis, so let's just say scale it to 1.5. In the y, we are not scaling anything, so we'll say 0 or 1. Yes?
Would it scaling the x affect the y since we made it ratio 1 to 1?
Ratio 1 to 1.
We set the image ratio.
Here is actually where we define what the scale is. So if we want it to be proportional, we would say 1.5 and 1.5, right? If we don't want it to be proportional, we would make the x more. So as we scale it, the x becomes bigger. Cool? Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
All right. The 1 to 1 was the initial value of my image. Okay? But the scale is different. That actually overrides what my image was. Right? So I started with a box, but I say, go ahead, take that box and stretch it. Cool? All right. Very good. Take that to do alt, and let's run the app again. One second, Xcode. Stop, run, attach in. Go to my property, and the port duck is now getting scaled, right? So I'm able to scale up, I'm able to scale down, and again, we could increase the value. If I want to make it stretch more, what value am I increasing? X, right? So X, we could stretch it up a bit more here. I could say 3, for example. And run it again. And at this point, I'll go back to my property animator, and I could stretch my duck even more. Cool? So that is the beauty of UI View Property Animator. This could easily be a pan. A pan is I'm dragging. So as I'm dragging some view, I could animate it based on the drag. Right? So picture our Google Maps or whatever we drag in. If I'm dragging the view, and I could give the logic such that if it passes 50, go ahead and just continue the animation. Right? If I'm less than 50 and the user stops, go back to the original value. Right? So the beauty of UI View Property Animator, there's a lot of animation capabilities you could add to your application. Right? So as we see gestures more next week, with pan gesture, for example, we could have pan gesture. So pan is very similar to what we do here with our slider. This is panning. Right? I'm dragging a slider over, that's panning. And then the UI View Property Animator is the animation itself. Like, what am I doing as I'm panning? Am I doing a scale? Am I doing a translation, for example? Right? What am I doing with that particular animation? Any questions? Yes, sir?
Yeah, will animations always override the constraints in the same way? Like, we set it up for like the 1-for-1 ratio
Yep.
and like it.
Yep. So good question. That's a question to Tangent Davis, right? So we started off, Matt's question was, we started off with our duck being in a UI image view such that it was a square, right? We said the width is the same as the height. But now we're going one step further, we're overriding that with a transform. And now we say we want our view to be transformed based on this scale. Cool?
Yeah.
Very good. So far we've seen some powerful animations, and as we said before, please take those animations into your own projects, right? Animate some view that starts. I click on something, we could animate it, right? You click on some button, the user probably wants to see some action. I click on the up button, the feedback for the user, very subtle, not too extravagant here, very subtle. You click on the up button, the user sees some interaction, right? I clicked on something. I'll also show us next week haptic feedback, right? Or even tomorrow, maybe, right? You know me. I'll show like haptic, like we have iPhones, right? Who has iPhones? Awesome. So we have iPhones. When we click on an iPhone, that feedback you get, right? Like a 3D-ish kind of feedback from the phone, the device. Like I like something on Instagram, I get like a pulsating action back on my finger. That's known as a haptic feedback. So we'll add haptic feedbacks to our gestures, right? So as we swipe, we'll get some like haptic feedback interaction, which is great. The user knows they did something. So cool. I think we will wrap up here, and we'll come back and talk more about animations as we do in review throughout the week. Okay? So we'll break here. We'll continue working on labs. Any questions with what we've done so far? Right? Any other questions? Right? And as with every app, we've started from removing storyboard because we're going into, yes, Chelsea? When you went back to, that could be a reproducible bug. We'll take a look at it after lesson. Cool? We probably just have to reset it. Like when you come back, just reset the value to the identity. That is very similar to what Kelby's here. That's probably very similar to what you saw with your animations. So when you come back to it, just set the identity back.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did it if you did appear?
I did it in.
You could do it in view will appear. Just set the identity so it.
I did it in the pair for reuse.
That was for your collection view.
Yeah.
Correct?
So.
Yeah. Okay. So it's very similar. Go ahead, Matt.
What are the, I mean, for UI view property animator, before we're using just like UI view.animate, what are there just, is it just a difference?
This is a newer API.
A new one. Can we do the old style animations using property animator, or is it like an entirely different?
I would do it separately.
Okay.
Like UI view property animator, I'll do it such that like in here, like if you pan in some view and you want to attach an animation to it, I would do it there because then you could go back to it. Basically, you could pause the animation, you could reverse the animation, but you cannot do that with UI view animators.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So Matt's question is, which one should you go with? UI view property animator is more powerful because you could revert your animation, you could continue your animation, you could pause your animation. But with UI view animations, there's no pausing or anything like that. When we get post CTA, we'll take a look at core animations, even more powerful. There's even more things you could do with core animation. Core animation is one level lower, like closer to the framework, like closer down to the metal. So core animation is more robust as into what you could do. You could do 3D animations like with simpler lines of code and stuff like that. But UIKit gives us a lot of things out of the box. Cool? So it's like UIKit, view animations, and UI view property animator. You could do a lot. Cool? Any other questions? Tomorrow we'll take a look at, not tomorrow, next week we'll take a look at keyframes. Okay? Keyframes where you have varied amounts of animations working together. Cool? So we'll use that same app and just build upon it. We'll have, right now we have 4 tabs. We'll build a 5th tab with keyframe animations. Cool? So that way we have a good tool to use as we build our own animations. And we'll do this very similar with gestures. We'll have 6 tabs of gestures where we have a tap gesture. What are the gesture? Tap gesture. Swipe gesture. Long press. More than one finger, okay. That's rotation, right? Rotation. We got pinching, right? All right, cool. So we'll have 6 gestures in that other app we built. So you'll have 2 cool apps where you could see, hey, even when you go to your job, like how did I do that animation? You go back to the app, you'll see it, and then we're trying to keep it as simple as possible with the code that we do, but you'll know how to get up and running. Does that make sense? All right, cool. So we'll stop here. Thank you.